Remember those clever kitchen tricks every 50s housewife swore by? Back then, they kept suppers hearty, waist low, and families proud. What got lost when we stopped passing them down? Buttered burgers in the oven. Back in the 1950s, not every family had a shiny charcoal grill in the backyard, and frying burgers on the stovetop could leave a greasy mess. So many housewives turned to their trusty ovens. The trick was simple but clever. Shape the patties, line them up on a baking sheet, and set a pat of butter right on top of each one. As the burgers baked, the butter slowly melted down, basting the meat and keeping it juicy. The smell of sizzling beef and browning butter filled the whole house, and you can bet kids were running to the kitchen to ask when supper would be ready. Some women added their own little twists, slipping a slice of onion under the patty or sprinkling a packet of Lipton onion soup mix into the meat, which was a real modern shortcut back then. This wasn't just about taste, it was about efficiency. With burgers baking hands-off in the oven, a housewife could mash potatoes, whip up a Jell-O mold, or even fold a load of laundry before supper. Once McDonald's drive-thrus and frozen TV dinners became the rage, the buttered burger trick quietly slipped into the past. But anyone who grew up in that era can still remember the rich smell of butter basting those oven-baked hamburgers. Simple, thrifty, and downright delicious. Mayonnaise and cake batter. Every 50s pantry had a jar of mayo, Duke's in the South, Hellmann's up north. And it wasn't just for ham sandwiches. Housewives discovered that mayonnaise could step in for eggs and oil in cake recipes. It sounds odd today, but when you realize mayo is just eggs and oil whisked together, it makes perfect sense. The result? Cakes that were moist, rich, and stayed soft for days under a glass dome on the counter. Recipes like chocolate mayonnaise cake and spice cake supreme popped up in church cookbooks and women's magazines, often described as foolproof, because the mayo added just the right amount of fat and binding. Some women swore their cakes turned out better this way, especially in humid southern kitchens, where desserts tended to dry out quickly. It was also a handy wartime holdover trick. When eggs or oil were scarce, mayo filled the gap. By the time boxed mixes improved in the 60s, most families stopped adding mayonnaise. But ask around, and plenty of grandmothers will still insist that a mayo cake is the moistest chocolate cake you'll ever taste. It's one of those little secrets that sounds strange until you've had a forkful. Storing lettuce with paper towels. In the 1950s, iceberg lettuce reigned supreme. Crisp, crunchy, and perfect for wedge salads, it showed up at nearly every supper table. But keeping it fresh was a challenge before pre-washed bagged salads and plastic clamshells. That's where a clever little trick came in. Housewives would wash the leaves, wrap them in slightly damp paper towels, and tuck the bundle into the refrigerator. The towels soaked up excess moisture, keeping the lettuce crisp for days instead of turning soggy. Before long, this method was passed from neighbor to neighbor, showing up in Good Housekeeping advice columns and whispered around bridge clubs. Tupperware containers eventually took over, promising freshness forever in pastel colors. But many women kept right on using their paper towel method, especially frugal homemakers who saw no reason to buy expensive gadgets when a roll of Scott towels did the job. Today, we just grab a bag of pre-chopped romaine or spring mix, but back then, keeping lettuce perky took a little know-how. And for folks who grew up eating crisp wedges drenched in Thousand Island dressing, that paper towel trick is a fond memory of a time when even salads had to be coaxed into staying fresh. Freezing leftovers in coffee cans. Before Ziploc bags and stackable Pyrex, housewives had to get creative with leftovers. Enter the trusty coffee can. Those sturdy Maxwell House and Folgers tins were far too useful to toss, so women scrubbed them clean and turned them into makeshift freezer containers. Soups, stews, spaghetti sauce, even casseroles went straight in. Once frozen solid, the food could be slid out in a neat cylinder, ready to be reheated in a saucepan or oven dish. It might not have looked elegant, but it was practical, cheap, and space-saving in the old chest freezers many families had in their basements. Some women even labeled each can with masking tape, stacking them like little soldiers ready for duty on a busy weeknight. You could walk into a neighbor's kitchen in 1957 and peek in the freezer to find a lineup of coffee cans holding a week's worth of suppers. Over time, plastic storage became the norm, and freezing in metal cans faded away. But there's something charming about the image of a resourceful housewife turning yesterday's Maxwell house into tomorrow's meatloaf container. It was recycling before recycling was even a buzzword. A pinch of salt in the coffee pot. Percolators were the workhorses of the 50s kitchen, bubbling away on stovetops morning after morning. But they had one problem. Coffee often turned bitter from over-extraction, especially if it sat too long. Housewives had a simple solution: a pinch of salt sprinkled right into the grounds. That tiny bit of seasoning softened the bitterness and smoothed out the flavor, creating a richer, less harsh cup. It wasn't written in cookbooks so much as passed along by word of mouth, neighbor to neighbor, or from mother to daughter. In some households, it was just understood that if you were making coffee, you added a little salt. Folgers and Maxwell House preferred to talk about their mountain-grown flavor in ads, but plenty of women quietly relied on the salt trick to keep breakfast pleasant. As drip machines and instant coffee took over in the 60s, the custom faded away, but old-timers still swear by it. It's one of those small, nearly invisible habits that tell the story of daily life in the 50s. Ordinary, practical, and forgotten by most, yet powerful in its simplicity. The ice cube trick for perfect deviled eggs. Deviled eggs were a staple at church socials and bridge luncheons, but peeling hard-boiled eggs could drive a housewife half-mad. Shells stuck, whites tore, and presentation was everything when your platter was going on the church basement table. The trick: after boiling, women would plunge the eggs into a bowl of ice water, sometimes with actual frozen cubes chipped from their refrigerator's metal trays. The rapid chill caused the egg to shrink just slightly inside the shell, making peeling so much easier. You'd hear the satisfying crack as the shell slipped off in neat pieces instead of stubborn flakes. Some magazines even recommended rolling the cooled egg on the counter to loosen it further. It was a little step that saved time and spared frustration, especially when you were making a dozen or more for Sunday dinner. Once modern eggs got fresher and peel-resistant, and plastic trays replaced those clanky metal ice cube molds, the trick became less common. But ask anyone who remembers helping their mother peel eggs for a picnic. They'll tell you the ice cube trick was the difference between a pretty platter and a plateful of egg salad. String for perfectly sliced cake. Not everyone had a drawer full of gadgets in the 50s, and electric knives were still years away from being common. If you wanted a neat slice of cake without crumbs sticking everywhere, you didn't reach for a knife. You grabbed a piece of plain kitchen string. Housewives would hold the string taut and gently pull it down through a cake, creating clean, even slices that looked downright professional. Some women even used dental floss before it was flavored, a thrifty solution pulled right from the medicine cabinet. This was especially useful for airy angel food cakes or layered confections straight from Betty Crocker's cookbook. It was a small trick, but it meant your cake slices looked like they came from a bakery window instead of a crumb pile on a plate. As serrated knives and store-bought cakes became the norm, the string method quietly disappeared. But in its day, it was a clever solution passed around neighborhood kitchens, proof that sometimes the simplest tools worked best. Wax paper as a non-stick hero. Long before non-stick pans and parchment paper rolls lined grocery shelves, wax paper was the unsung hero of the kitchen. Housewives laid it down to keep cookies from sticking, wrapped sandwiches for lunchboxes, and even pressed it over frosting to keep cakes smooth while setting. A square of wax paper between cheese slices in the icebox kept them from gluing together, and children knew it as the wrapper around every peanut butter and jelly sandwich packed for school. Women even rubbed a bit of wax paper on their icebox shelves to prevent rust spots. It was cheap, versatile, and always in the drawer. Reynolds advertised it as miracle paper, and many women treated it that way. Over time, plastic wrap and parchment paper muscled in, but wax paper was the real workhorse of the 50s kitchen. Today it mostly lives on for candy makers and old-fashioned cooks, but in its heyday, it was a housewife's best friend, and one box lasted months. Bread to keep sugar soft. Every pantry had a canister of sugar, but in humid kitchens, it often hardened into stubborn clumps. Housewives discovered that dropping a slice of fresh bread into the jar worked like magic. The bread absorbed the excess moisture, keeping the sugar soft and scoopable for coffee, baking, or cereal. Some women swore by apple slices instead, which had the same effect, but added a faint sweetness. It was one of those quiet tricks that rarely made it into magazines, but everybody seemed to know. You'd open a sugar jar in 1957 and find a half-dry slice of Wonder Bread at the bottom, not for eating, but for saving the sugar. When sealed bags and moisture-proof canisters came along, the bread trick faded into obscurity. But if you ever ask a grandmother how to keep brown sugar from turning into a brick, don't be surprised if she says, "Just toss a piece of bread in there, honey. Works every time." Chilling bowls for whipped cream. Whipped cream was a prized topping in the 1950s, but getting it stiff and fluffy without collapsing was tricky in warm kitchens. The solution? Chill your mixing bowl and beaters in the icebox beforehand. Women learned this from magazines like Good Housekeeping or directly from their own mothers. When the cream hit that frosty bowl, it thickened quickly and whipped up high, ready to crown a Jell-O salad or a slice of chocolate pie. This trick became a kind of ritual. Bowls placed in the fridge first thing in the morning if you knew company was coming that night. Heavy cream wasn't cheap, so nobody wanted a runny mess after all that whipping. Eventually, aerosol cans of Ready Whip made things faster, but old-fashioned whipped cream still had a taste and texture nothing could beat. To this day, a few cooks still chill their bowls, keeping alive a simple trick that made desserts a little more elegant on a 1950s supper table. Vinegar to rescue burnt pans. Every housewife had a favorite saucepan, and sometimes it ended up scorched after oatmeal or gravy stuck fast to the bottom. Scrubbing with steel wool risked scratching it, so women relied on vinegar. The trick was to pour in a little vinegar and water, bring it to a simmer, and let the acid loosen the blackened bits. Magazines like Ladies' Home Journal ran this tip as a miracle solution, and it really worked. Plus, it left the pan shining like new. Housewives swore by vinegar for dozens of chores, brightening coffee pots, deodorizing sinks, and even shining windows. Bottles of Heinz vinegar sat on shelves not just as an ingredient, but as a cure-all cleaner long before green cleaning was trendy. As non-stick cookware and dishwasher detergents came along, the vinegar trick faded from daily use. But anyone who grew up in the 50s can recall the sharp, tangy smell of vinegar bubbling on the stove as a scorched pan came back to life. Celery in water to keep it crisp. Celery was the workhorse of 1950s kitchens, chopped into casseroles, stuffed with pimento cheese, or fanned out on relish trays for company. But limp celery was no good. The trick? Stand the stalks upright in a glass of cold water in the icebox. Housewives discovered this would rehydrate the stalks, turning them crisp and snappy again. Sometimes they'd even add a few ice cubes for good measure. This little hack often appeared in the kitchen tips columns of the day, right next to hints for polishing silver. Kids remembered the sight of tall ball jars filled with celery in the fridge, ready to be pulled out for after-school snacks, spread with peanut butter. With today's pre-trimmed bags of celery hearts, we don't think much about reviving vegetables. But in the 50s, making produce last an extra week was a small victory, and a glass of cold water could make celery crunch like it was fresh from the garden. Cleaning cast iron with salt. In the South especially, cast iron skillets were sacred. You didn't dare scrub them with soap because soap was said to ruin the seasoning. Instead, housewives cleaned their skillets with coarse salt. After frying chicken or bacon, They'd pour in a handful of Morton's salt and use a rag or potato half to scrub out the grease and bits. The salt scoured without stripping away the precious seasoned layer, leaving the pan ready for the next meal. Women passed this trick down like gospel, and every seasoned cook had her own method. Some swore by wiping with newspaper afterward. Others rubbed in a touch of lard before putting it away. Over time, dishwashers and non-stick pans replaced this ritual, but cast iron lovers still keep the salt trick alive. For many, it wasn't just about cleaning. It was about respecting the skillet that fed the family day after day, storing bacon grease in coffee jars. Nothing in a 50s kitchen went to waste, especially bacon drippings. Housewives carefully poured the hot grease through a strainer into jars, often old glass coffee jars with metal lids, and kept them on the stove or in the icebox. That grease flavored everything: green beans, cornbread, fried potatoes, even gravies. Some women kept a designated grease jar right beside the salt and pepper, decorated with a lid from a jelly jar or labeled with masking tape. It wasn't just thrift, it was tradition. You could walk into almost any kitchen and see a jar of golden bacon fat sitting proudly, ready to be used. By the 1970s, when cholesterol warnings hit the airwaves, many families abandoned the grease jar. But anyone who grew up in the 50s knows that real flavor often started with a spoonful of bacon drippings, saved in a humble jar by a practical housewife who wasted nothing. Mason jars as everyday helpers. Long before Pinterest made them trendy, mason jars were an everyday tool in the 50s kitchen. Housewives used them for everything: canning peaches, storing leftovers, holding dry goods, and even serving sweet tea. A fridge might have jars filled with leftover soup, sliced pickled beets, or homemade pudding, each covered with wax paper and a rubber band. Kids often grabbed cold milk straight from a mason jar, poured at breakfast without a second thought. These jars were durable, affordable, and endlessly reusable. A perfect match for thrifty homemakers. Ball and Kerr were the big names, and nearly every family had boxes of jars tucked in the pantry or cellar. Over time, plastic containers pushed them aside, but mason jars never truly disappeared. Today, they're seen as vintage chic, but in the 1950s, they were simply the most reliable multi-tool in the kitchen. Housewives knew that if you had a shelf of mason jars, you had storage, serving, and saving all covered. Ice cube trays for leftover stock. Every chicken dinner in the 1950s ended with bones simmered into stock. Nothing went to waste. But storing that golden liquid wasn't always simple. The clever solution? Pour cooled stock into those clunky aluminum ice cube trays with the pull-up handle. Once frozen, the cubes were popped out and saved in bags or jars, ready to drop into sauces, gravies, or soups. It meant you didn't have to thaw a whole quart just to flavor a casserole. Kids often thought they were sneaking ice cubes, only to find chicken-flavored popsicles instead. This little trick made sense in a time when freezer space was precious and seasoning packets weren't yet filling grocery shelves. Later, bouillon cubes and canned broth pushed it aside. But for thrifty housewives, an ice cube tray was more than just a place for lemonade cubes. It was a tool for stretching every last drop of flavor. Newspaper for grease and odors. Before paper towels came cheap and plentiful, yesterday's newspaper did double duty in the kitchen. Housewives used it to blot fried chicken or bacon, soak up grease from counters, or even wrap scraps before tossing them in the trash. One especially clever trick was using crumpled newspaper to deodorize. Slip some into shoes, line the fridge shelves, or pack it in lunch pails to keep them fresh. The ink smudged, of course, and no one would dream of it today. But back then, it was simply practical. Housewives who grew up during the Depression never wasted a thing, and a newspaper was too handy to throw away unread. You'd see wads of it under the sink, ready for the next mess. By the 1970s, Bounty and Ziploc replaced those humble sheets, but the smell of fried chicken laid out on yesterday's headlines is a memory etched in many kitchens of the 1950s. flour sack towels for just about everything. Before multi-purpose cloths became a marketing gimmick, housewives knew the humble flour sack towel could do it all. After buying flour in 50-pound sacks, they'd wash, bleach, and hem the fabric into soft, durable towels. These became dishcloths, strainer cloths, even makeshift aprons. Some women embroidered pretty borders on them, turning simple sacks into kitchen treasures. They dried dishes without lint, polished glass until it sparkled, and were gentle enough for proofing bread. Best of all, they were practically free, part of that thrifty, use-it-up, wear-it-out mindset every housewife lived by. As packaging changed and flour came in paper bags, the practice faded, though you'll still spot flour sack towels in country kitchens. For women of the 50s, they weren't retro chic or boutique items. They were the everyday fabric of life, transformed by clever hands into something endlessly useful. Potato water for gravy. Boiling potatoes for supper was routine in the 1950s, and thrifty cooks knew never to waste that cloudy cooking water. It was full of starch, perfect for thickening gravies, soups, and sauces. Instead of pouring it down the drain, they saved a cup or two, using it to stretch pan drippings into silky brown gravy, or to enrich a pot of vegetable soup. Some even claimed it gave yeast bread a fluffier rise when used in place of plain water. Housewives learned this from their mothers, many of whom had carried the trick through the lean depression years. By the 60s, when cornstarch and instant mixes became popular, fewer women bothered saving potato water. But anyone who grew up in a thrifty kitchen remembers the way it was carefully poured into a jar on the counter. Proof that in the 1950s, every scrap and drop had a second life. Using jars to roll pie crusts. Not everyone in the 50s had a wooden rolling pin, but nearly everyone had an empty glass bottle or jar. Resourceful housewives rolled out pie crusts with Coke bottles, mason jars, or even smooth peanut butter jars. The glass kept the dough cool, and if you popped the jar in the icebox first, it worked even better. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done, especially when a last-minute pie was needed for a church potluck or a neighbor's visit. Kids often watched in awe as Mama rolled dough with a bottle that had been holding ketchup just the week before. Rolling pins eventually became standard in every kitchen drawer, but the memory of a clever woman turning pantry scraps into pastry tools is part of what made 1950s kitchens so resourceful. A pie crust rolled with a Coke bottle may not have been fancy, but it sure tasted like home. Toothpicks to test cakes. In the 1950s, ovens didn't always heat evenly, and timers weren't the most reliable. So how did housewives know when a cake was ready? They reached for a toothpick. A quick poke in the center told the tale. If it came out clean, the cake was done. If crumbs clung, it needed a few more minutes. It was a simple trick passed from mother to daughter, often used while baking boxed mixes that were just hitting the shelves. Some women even used broom straws before toothpicks became cheap and plentiful. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and it saved many a birthday cake from being pulled out half-baked. Today, we rely on digital timers, oven lights, and recipes with precise bake times. But back then, the toothpick test was the gold standard. For many women, it wasn't just a baking hack. It was a little ritual, part of the rhythm of homemaking in a decade when every cake on the table meant celebration. Potato slices to rescue too salty soup. Stretching food was the name of the game, and nothing was more frustrating than oversalting a pot of soup. Housewives had a clever fix. Drop in a few raw potato slices and let them simmer. The potatoes absorbed the excess salt, mellowing the flavor and saving supper. This trick often came up in advice columns and church cookbooks, passed around like a little piece of kitchen magic. Women swore it saved countless meals, especially when cooking in bulk for family gatherings. After simmering, the potatoes were fished out and tossed, having done their quiet duty. By the 1970s, when bouillon cubes and canned soups became more common, the potato trick faded from daily life. But anyone who remembers their mother hovering over a pot of ham and bean soup, dropping in potato slices with a hopeful prayer, knows just how valuable this little hack once was. Waxing cheese to make it last. Refrigeration was common by the 50s, but freezers were small, and not every kitchen had room for endless perishables. To keep cheese from drying out or molding too quickly, some housewives dipped blocks of cheddar or Colby in melted paraffin wax. This old-time preservation trick, borrowed from farm wives, kept cheese fresh for weeks. You'd spot wax-sealed wedges lined up in the pantry, a flash of red or yellow color against the shelves. It wasn't just practical, it was thrifty, since wasting cheese was unthinkable. Later, companies like Kraft sold pre-waxed cheese products, and eventually shrink-wrap packaging made home waxing unnecessary. Still, for resourceful homemakers in the 1950s, waxing cheese was one more way to stretch groceries, and the memory of peeling away that shiny coating is one of those tactile little details that instantly takes you back. Hanging dishcloths in the sun. Laundry appliances were improving, but kitchens were still humid, and dishcloths could sour quickly if left damp. The solution? Housewives pinned them to the clothesline outside, letting sunlight and fresh air work their magic. The sun bleached out stains and left the cloths smelling crisp and clean, no fancy detergent needed. Neighbors would often see a row of dishcloths fluttering beside bedsheets, part of the daily rhythm of homemaking. Housewives took pride in having fresh linens, and a sour dish rag was considered a real embarrassment. By the 1960s, paper towels and synthetic cloths reduced the problem, and dishwashers meant fewer rags needed washing. But for anyone who grew up in that era, the image of a sunny afternoon and bright white dishcloth swaying in the breeze is as vivid a kitchen memory as the meals that cloth helped prepare. Keeping brown sugar soft with marshmallows. Brown sugar was a staple in the 50s kitchen, used for cookies, baked beans, and candied sweet potatoes. But without airtight containers, it hardened into stubborn lumps. Housewives came up with a sweet little trick. Drop a marshmallow or two into the canister. The marshmallow's moisture kept the sugar soft and scoopable. Kids often thought it was a treat to find candy hiding in the sugar jar, but it had a practical purpose. Some women preferred slices of apple or bread, but marshmallows were neat, inexpensive, and always on hand thanks to Jell-O salads and Rice Krispies treats. This trick was passed down like folklore, appearing in community cookbooks and homemaking columns. By the time resealable bags and plastic tubs arrived, the marshmallow method wasn't as necessary. But for many homemakers in the 50s, it was one more way of keeping the kitchen running smoothly with a touch of cleverness and a touch of sweetness. Toothpaste for silver polishing. In the 1950s, every housewife had silver to shine, whether it was grandma's flatware or a treasured tea set brought out for company. Store-bought silver polish wasn't always cheap or handy, so many women reached for something already in the bathroom cabinet. Plain white toothpaste. A dab on a rag and a bit of elbow grease would buff away tarnish, leaving spoons and serving pieces gleaming for Sunday dinner. The trick passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor, often mentioned in homemaking columns alongside vinegar and baking soda remedies. The minty smell might have been out of place in the kitchen, but the results spoke for themselves. By the time specialized cleaners and dishwashers became common, toothpaste lost its place as a multi-purpose miracle. Damp cloth over salad to keep it fresh. When entertaining, no one wanted wilted lettuce or soggy potato salad sitting out on the buffet table. The trick? Cover the bowl with a damp cloth. Housewives discovered that laying a clean, moistened towel across a salad kept it cool, crisp, and appetizing until mealtime. It was a lifesaver for church socials and backyard picnics before cling wrap existed. This little hack was often listed in community cookbooks and homemaking guides, alongside tips for arranging flowers or setting a proper table. Women even embroidered their cloths so they looked presentable, draped across a dish at a potluck. By the 1960s, clear plastic wrap stole the spotlight, letting everyone see the food underneath. But for homemakers of the 1950s, a damp cloth over a salad wasn't just a trick. Shaking cream in a jar for butter. Every child in the 1950s probably remembers shaking a mason jar of cream until their arms ached, waiting for it to turn into butter. It wasn't just a farm trick. Suburban housewives sometimes did it too, especially when cream was plentiful or as a fun way to involve the kids. Add a pinch of salt, and you had fresh butter to spread on biscuits or cornbread that very evening. Articles in Better Homes and Gardens occasionally suggested it as a back-to-basics project, and home economics teachers used it to demonstrate how food transformed. It was messy, it was time-consuming, and by the late 50s, most families simply bought Land O'Lakes or Blue Bonnet margarine. Still, the memory of sitting at the table, passing a jar of cream around until it sloshed less and lumped more, is the kind of nostalgic moment that connects people instantly back to childhood kitchens. Rice to keep salt flowing. In humid 1950s kitchens, salt shakers often clumped into a stubborn brick. Instead of fancy gadgets, housewives relied on a thrifty trick. Drop a few grains of uncooked rice into the shaker. The rice absorbed the extra moisture, keeping the salt loose and ready to sprinkle. Every kitchen had at least one shaker rattling faintly with little white kernels inside, a sound as familiar as the rattle of the percolator on the stove. Some women even taught their children that if they heard rice in the shaker, it meant Mama knew her business. The trick was so common that Morton salt ads leaned into it with the famous "When it rains, it pours" slogan, reminding homemakers their salt wouldn't clump. Over time, anti-caking agents made the practice less necessary, but the memory of shaking a glass salt jar and hearing that tiny rattle of rice is one of those small details that instantly transports you back to the 1950s supper table. Hanging bananas to slow ripening. Fresh fruit wasn't as abundant year-round in the 50s, so keeping it from spoiling was important. Bananas, in particular, ripened quickly in warm kitchens. The solution? Hang them. Housewives learned that hanging bananas from a hook or a dedicated stand kept them from bruising and slowed the ripening process by letting air circulate. It wasn't uncommon to see a small banana hanger tucked near the bread box, holding the week's fruit supply. This simple trick appeared in homemaking tips, right alongside how to keep celery crisp or how to ripen green tomatoes on the windowsill. By the time larger supermarkets made bananas cheaper and more plentiful, people worried less about extending their shelf life. But in the 1950s, a housewife's cleverness often meant stretching produce as far as possible. And the sight of bananas swinging gently from a hook was one more reminder of her quiet ingenuity. There you have it. The kitchens of the 1950s may not have had microwaves, air fryers, or even reliable timers, but they had something better. Women who knew how to make do, stretch a dollar, and keep a household humming. From buttered burgers to coffee can leftovers, these tricks weren't just about saving time. They were about saving supper and saving face when company came knocking. Many of these little hacks faded when convenience foods and modern gadgets took over, but they remind us of a time when resourcefulness was a badge of honor. I'd love to hear from you. What clever kitchen tricks do you remember from your mother's or grandmother's kitchen? Did she have her own special way of stretching food, keeping things fresh, or saving a meal? Share your memories down in the comments, because those little stories are part of what keeps our history alive.